All right, so welcome to U.S. Society and Culture. Uh, Basically, to give you an idea of how this class is going to work, um, we cover kind of the history of American popular culture um, from mostly from like the post World War II era, but we do a little bit before because I want to give you kind of the background on what popular culture is like in America. Uh, One thing I want you to think about is what is popular culture, okay, versus regular culture. Culture, of course, is the story of people's backgrounds and uh, natural cultural things that are part of every unique people's story. Popular culture are more about things that essentially are popular for a certain time period or something like that. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with people from like different cultures. These are attitudes or things that are enjoyed by people regardless of gender or race or background or anything like that. Um, and popular culture aspects come to define kind of the period in which they exist. And popular culture also changes, from era to era, from decade to decade, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to talk about today are some of the early beginnings of popular culture, and I want you to think about how it connects with our world today and the things that are relevant in popular culture today, social media, and you know, streaming and the music we listen to and the movies we watch and the TV that we watch and the clothes we wear and all that stuff. Um, so what we're going to talk about today is kind of the early beginnings of popular culture in America. Um, Popular culture begins really essentially when you're talking about early U.S. history. There's not many ways to communicate popular culture. So how do we do that? It's largely done through literature. The books that were written a couple hundred years ago oftentimes express kind of the cultural attitudes that existed in America during that time. So popular authors and people that live in a certain time period, really are the only way that we can truly express what popular culture was before we had radio, before we had television, before we had movies, right? Things like that. So that's the beginning of it. Let's talk a little bit now about popular culture in the latter part of the 19th century. So early popular culture in America, um, sadly, in one way, that was a big pop culture phenomenon in the years leading up to and the years following the Civil War, were minstrel shows. And what minstrel shows were was a really sad depiction of African Americans in a joking fashion. These were very popular in the South, and this is where things like blackface became popular, where you would take white actors and they would, of course, portray African Americans in usually kind of a less than positive light. And of course, now in today's social framework, you hear a lot about blackface and how offensive that is. But again, when you're talking about popular culture in a white dominated society in the Civil War era and afterwards, this was something that was deemed acceptable. It wouldn't be until the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, and then maybe early into the 1900s, the 20th century, that blackface and minstrel shows and things like that were generally regarded as something that's bad and we shouldn't be doing it. And they quickly fell out of popularity, quickly fell out of favor with people. Another way that people would express popular culture in the early days of American history was through the circus. I don't know if you've ever been to the circus, but the circus in the latter half of the 19th century was extremely popular. The most famous circus man, P.T. Barnum, that's the guy pictured here, would create this circuses that would travel all over the country, largely by train, and would put on shows for people. You'd have exotic animals or, high flying trapeze acts or tightrope walkers or things of that nature. This was clowns. This was a form of entertainment that was very popular for people in the latter part of the 19th century. Again, This is before we have television. This is before we have radio. This is before we have movies. So the circus is a good way for people to find something to do that everybody can enjoy, um, and people go to that. Of course, the circus is something else that ultimately fell out of favor with people because of the mistreatment of animals. And now, even though you can still find circuses around different places in America nowadays, they're much harder to find and are much less popular. Around the turn of the 20th century, we have the arrival of vaudeville shows or vaudeville acts. Now, these were kind of strange. Um, Vaudeville acts included, things that people would call oddities, where they would have kind of people do strange things like, a guy laying on a bed of nails, or like a sword swallower, or a fire eater, or sadly, they would take people that had kind of like strange physical deformities and call them, freaks for like freak shows or something of that nature. Sadly, it's a way, again, also to make fun of people, but these were extremely popular in the America of 100+ years ago. One thing that came out of vaudeville acts that is still popular and still around today is stand-up comedy. Comedians would come on and tell jokes about various things like stand-up comedians do today. And many of the popular stand-up comedians of the 20th century, you probably haven't heard of any of them, but maybe you have people like Bob Hope, George Burns, many others, got their start as vaudeville acts, as vaudeville performers. So the significance of vaudeville is something that has stuck around for a long time, even today. Again, all three of these examples are things that really do things that in society today would not be found acceptable. Making fun of people, obviously making fun of people's race through blackface, mistreatment of animals, or using people with some sort of deformity as props. Okay, so this shows you how pop culture changes in America to a point now where what we find to be more acceptable is very different than what we found to be acceptable 100 years ago or before. The other thing that in early American popular culture was relevant were sporting events, spectator sports. Sports have always been around, but the concept of spectator sports is something that was new late in the 1800s. Particularly sports like boxing were extremely popular. This was John L. Sullivan, one of the first great boxing champions. Horse racing was popular still today, and of course baseball. These were the early popular sports that people would go spend money to go watch a game. And these things were ways that people could be social, could go out and gamble if they wanted to do that. So lots of examples here of things that we would call a popular culture phenomenon. So let's move now to the beginning of the 20th century. Early in the 20th century, we get the beginning of radio and the silent film era. Before movies could talk, before you could hear dialogue between two people in a movie, you had silent films. Silent films were very different. On the email, I'm going to include a link for you to a scene from a popular silent film from the 1920s. But in the 1910s, we have the first arrival of silent films. The first ever, what's considered to be the first ever motion picture or silent film was a very crude movie in 1902 called The Great Train Robbery. Okay, The Great Train Robbery. There wasn't much sound. It was just action, kind of video of people or moving pictures of people robbing a train. By the 19 teens, you see the evolution of film to the silent film era, where early popular films like Birth of a Nation come along. Now, this is a very controversial movie because of its very racist overtones. In the movie, you have this kind of fictional South after the Civil War, where African Americans have kind of taken over and messed up the government, and all the white people are scared, and They use a lot of characters in blackface in it, so it's offensive in that regard. But the real offensive thing about this film is that it hails the Ku Klux Klan as these heroes that are going to save the South from, from the African Americans that have taken over. Uh, it's a horribly racist film, but it's also a very important film in that it's generally regarded as the first real motion picture, first real movie, full-length film. When you watch that clip from the movie I'm going to send you, it's called Blood and Sand, you'll notice that the actors and actresses in there have to be very over the top and very physical in their performance so they can convey the emotions of the scene, since there's no dialogue between characters. You have also storyboards, little signs that in between scenes that kind of explain what's happening. But silent films were extremely popular. Now they look terrible and poorly made and stupid, but you got to imagine that for the time with which they came about, they were incredibly popular because nobody had ever seen anything like that before. The first stars of the film era was probably one you've heard of, Charlie Chaplin. He starred in many comedic roles in the 19 teens and 20s. And another one by the name of Rudolph Valentino, who's the guy who's pictured here, who's generally regarded as like the first real sex symbol major star of movies. Sadly, he died in like 1927, 1925, 26 in a car accident. Valentino is like this first real sex symbol, and Charlie Chaplin kind of are the big stars of the silent film era. Radio, being able to transmit sound and conversation between people, first arrives in about 1920 out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The first broadcasted radio transmission was actually sharing results of the 1920 presidential election. And radio programming, of course, is going to change the way that people listen to and hear and understand the world around them. Just like we do with social media today and the internet and the ability for people to communicate so quickly, radio programming does the same thing. It allows people to communicate information much more quickly and effectively, and it changes the way that we live our lives. We also have Tin Pan Alley. Now, simply what that is the beginning of the American record industry. Tin Pan Alley was an area in New York where immigrant children would go and kind of bang on pots and pans, and they did it and kind of made music out of it, and it became kind of popular. So some guy decided, hey, I could record this and make money off of it. And people would buy records or buy examples of people playing these pots and pans. And ultimately, that is how the American record industry is born, just off some immigrant kids playing these pots and pans in a rhythmic way that, again, becomes very, very popular. Now, popular culture, as we understand it, really begins in America during the 1920s. In the 1920s, of course, is Prohibition. This is when alcohol is illegal, and lots of other challenges and things exist for people, during this time. But it's also a time where popular culture attitudes really develop in the country. Okay, so we begin to first kind of see real examples, vestiges or examples, kind of the same thing, of popular culture appear during the 1920s. What are some of these examples? One, you have clubs where people would go to dance and listen to jazz music. Jazz is like the first big popular music movement in American history. And of course, this jazz music is largely popularized and played by African Americans. This is very important because jazz music and these clubs become one of the first times that there is like a cultural collision between African American culture being embraced by many whites as well. And the most notable figure in this movement is a guy by the name of Duke Ellington. That's him there. He was the jazz performer, a pianist, and he had his band at a place called the Cotton Club in Harlem. And this was extremely popular for both whites and blacks to go and enjoy the music, enjoy the jazz during the 1920s. We see sports gain big popularity in the 1920s. Boxing and baseball in particular. The 1920s is the era of Babe Ruth, who of course was the transcendent baseball player of that era. The great boxer of the 1920s was a guy by the name of Jack Dempsey. These guys were extremely popular. They were major celebrities, and they're the type of people that everybody kind of cared what they were doing and wanted to know what and wanted to be like them, etc., etc. That's really bad handwriting, by the way. I'm sorry. So people really cared about these people, and we have kind of the birth of modern celebrity in America. Okay. Also with sports, you have college football is popular. The NFL begins in about 1920. You have other sports gaining in popularity. So athletes are starting to become significant pop culture figures themselves. Okay, oops, sorry this all came up. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the Depression era. Okay, so you'd think the Great Depression was really a bad time for popular culture, but it turns out it was really a great time for popular culture. Mostly because during the Depression era, people needed something to enjoy, something to look forward to. They needed an escape from the problems of the Great Depression, from the problems of going hungry and not having any money and things like that. So what were some of the things that people did? Well, one popular phenomenon, which comes from the 1920s and the Jazz Age, are dance marathons. People would go and participate in these dance contests that would sometimes last for several weeks, in which you would dance for 45 minutes out of the hour, and it would go on as long as it took until there was only one couple remaining. And so these were kind of like a funky, popular example of something that people did during the 1930s, during the Depression, to kind of escape from the sorrows that the Depression kind of brought. Radio also plays an important role during this time. Before people had TVs, you imagine your family room or your living room at your house. There's a big TV in there, and maybe the family comes together and watches TV or movies sometimes. People didn't have that in the 1930s. So instead of a TV, you would have a radio in the family room, and people would come and listen to what they called serial programs on the radio. They would either be things like, often President Franklin Roosevelt would give his fireside chats, which basically during the Depression he would get on there and, reassure the people that things were going to get better. You would also have programs, sometimes comedy programs, soap operas, dramatic programs in which people would listen to a radio as they would watch a TV. You would have the actors would just speak whatever they were saying. The only difference is you wouldn't be able to see anybody. Some of the most popular radio stars, when TV came around, would transfer into becoming television stars. Most notably, I Love Lucy started as a radio serial program, and eventually became obviously a big television hit in the 1950s. We also see in the 1930s that movies gain sound and grow massively in popularity. Talking about no longer having silent films, you have what are called talkies, films in which you could have dialogue between two characters, and movies became much easier to follow. It was cheap entertainment. For a quarter, you could go see a double feature, meaning you go see two movies and get some popcorn. This was especially good for people that in the wintertime, if they didn't have any heat in their house, they could go to a heated movie theater and get warm. In the summertime, if it's too hot, they maybe could go in there because it's cooler or air conditioned sometimes inside these movie theaters. So that would be an option for folks. But films gain a ton of popularity during the 1930s. The biggest stars of the 1930s would star in a lot of movies. Hollywood would crank movies out like crazy. The biggest stars of the era, people like Clark Gable, James Cagney, Jean Harlow, Shirley Temple, they would be in 5, 6, 7 movies every year, right? The biggest stars nowadays, people like Tom Hanks and others, and I don't know who else. They might be in 1 movie a year, maybe 2. So films are coming out all the time, right? And the final kind of cultural phenomenon of the 1930s was bank robbers. This became known as the Robin Hood syndrome. Bank robbers became very, very popular during the 1930s because of that Robin Hood mentality, rob from the rich and give to the poor. A lot of people blamed banks for losing their money during the Great Depression. People took their money to the bank ran out of money, people blamed the banks. So you have these bank robbers that would go and rob the banks, take out, and take the money, and they were hailed as heroes. People like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, not the rapper, an actual guy that was named Machine Gun Kelly back then. These people were extremely popular because they were, robbing from the rich, even though they weren't giving to the poor necessarily. It was a way of getting back at the banks for everybody losing their money during the Great Depression. Okay, so I'm going to send you a couple links to a couple videos I want you to watch, and then we're going to do like kind of listen to a radio program. I'll email you the assignment for that, as well as put it up on Moodle, and that's about it. I'll put another video together for you tomorrow or Friday as we kind of continue to work through kind of this first unit here. If you have any questions, please email me or let me know, and hopefully this worked for you and you're able to get most of the stuff. But yeah, just let me know if you have any questions about anything, and we should be good. All right. So thanks a lot, and I'll have another one for you later on.